Hello everyone, Tom here. Things are heating up and I'm not talking about the weather. Before we get into this episode, all change in Westminster. Yesterday, Sir Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, resigned. Nominations for Labour leadership will open shortly. And if more than one candidate comes forward, there will be a leadership election. If not, that one candidate becomes Labour leader and Prime Minister. The man in pole position, one Andy Burnham, former Mayor of Manchester, now MP for Makerfield. Absolutely extraordinary. Mayor on Thursday, elected as MP in the early hours of Friday, sworn in on Monday as an MP in Westminster, and now front runner for Prime Minister. They used to say that a week was a long time in politics. Not even a week has passed and so much has changed. Today's episode is about Brexit. We know it was a long time ago, but today is a special anniversary. More on that later. In the next few days, we'll be putting out an emergency podcast episode focused on the Makerfield by-election, Starmer's resignation, a little profile on Andy Burnham, and a bit of a reflection not only on the 2 years of Starmer's regime in 10 Downing Street, but also the 2 years anniversary of this podcast. Anyway, now back to usual proceedings. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Political Dispatch, the podcast where we explore the world's headlines and trace their roots through the past to make sense of the present. I'm Lily Mott.
I'm Tom Spare.
And I'm Sid Gurapati.
Welcome to part 2 of our 3-part mini-series on Brexit. If you're listening to this episode on the 23rd of June, it is 10 years to the day since the UK voted to leave the European Union.
In our previous episode, we interviewed Dr. Nicholas Starton about the history of British Euroscepticism, looking at the key events that led to Brexit. In today's episode, you'll hear from Dr. Mike Berry from Cardiff University on the Brexit referendum itself.
That's right. Tom and I went back to the School of Journalism, Media and Culture, where Tom, Lily, and I met to interview Dr. Berry, who runs the MA in Political Communication at JOMEC.
Sid conducted the interview with Dr. Berry. They covered a range of topics, including why immigration dominated the Brexit debate, how the media shaped the way the public viewed the EU, what made the slogan "Take Back Control" so evocative, and whether Britain would vote the same way today.
So here's Sid's conversation with Dr. Mike Berry on the Brexit referendum.
Well, at 20 minutes to 5, we can now say the decision taken in 1975 by this country to join the common market has been reversed by this referendum to leave the EU.
The British people have made a choice. That not only needs to be respected, but those on the losing side of the argument, myself included, should help to make it work.
Let June the 23rd go down in our history as our Independence Day.
Conference, mark my words, we will make Brexit a success.
The British people have spoken and the answer is we're out.
So yeah, Mike, thank you for joining us on Political Dispatch today. You're currently the director of the MA in Political Communications program. I mean, we learned under you a couple of years ago, from 2023 to 2024. I think Lily was there for some of the modules where we had common modules. We're here to talk about Brexit. But before we get into that, we just want to start with you and get to know a little more about you as to what drew you to academia, and in particular, what was the media, what was it about media and communication that you found so compelling?
I'm going to kind of go back to kind of what I guess was the kind of sort of light bulb moment, really. And it took place in the United States, and it must have been around 1993. I was doing a degree in sociology and psychology at Bath University. And that was a sandwich degree, a 4-year degree. And as part of the degree in the 3rd year, you could go into industry, or you could go and go to a university somewhere and study at another university. And I really wanted to go and study at another university and do some research. And I was scrabbling around for something to do, and I kind of came across the idea of something around kind of media and media effects, and I ended up going to the University of California in Santa Barbara, and I spent a year there, and I worked on a project there for the cable television industry, a big project, $3 million project that had just been secured by University of California, Santa Barbara. And while I was there, I happened to go to a film one night. It was actually the film about the life of the American linguist Noam Chomsky, and it was called Manufacturing Consent. And that talked about a lot about American foreign policy and reporting. And I hadn't really known anything about this before. And it was kind of just one of those moments where you see something in your life and you hear something, and it kind of leads you to kind of question how society operates, how the media operates. And it was kind of one of those kind of light bulb moments that got me really interested in the media. And while I was in California, I kind of went through well, actually, I kind of came back to the UK, and then I was invited back to go to California to continue working on that project after I finished my degree. And I kind of went back and I did an MA there. And while I was there, I was kind of thinking, should I stay on and do a PhD? But I realized I was much more interested in looking at kind of political communication and kind of the kind of critical study of communication. And while I was there, I began reading about the work of scholars in Glasgow Media Group, and I thought these are the people I kind of want to work with. And I came back to the UK, spent a couple of years doing kind of various jobs, trying to get the money together to kind of do my PhD. Worked for a couple of years as a postman in Bath. And then I went to Glasgow in 1994 and started a PhD looking at the media. And my real interest from then on has been really the interface between media and public opinion. So how do people build up a picture of how the world works, about social issues, about the social world, and what is the role of the media amongst various other kind of socialization agents?
I think that's a pretty good segue into our next question, which is talking about public opinion when the whole Brexit campaign was kind of kicking off. And, David Cameron was on a bit of a sticky wicket to do the referendum that he promised or not. And I suppose a lot of the political parties were kind of gauging what their opinion's going to be, what's the government going to do, and what the Remain campaign and the Leave campaign kind of was shaping up to be. Where was the British public, opinion of the British public on big issues like immigration and farming and education? And what was the perception of the EU back then, 10 years ago?
Okay. Well, in the kind of the lead up to the referendum, obviously immigration was a huge issue. It's been a huge issue for decades. It's something that politicians have talked about very frequently, and even more so the media has been an issue that they've been banging on about and framing very, very negatively for a long period of time. So it's something that had very, very high public salience. I mean, I know going out to do, focus groups with members of the public, and you'd be talking about a completely unrelated issue, and within 5 minutes, everybody's just started talking spontaneously about immigration. And immigration is one of those kind of flypaper issues. Yeah. Whatever people have concerns about, it kind of gets blamed on immigration. And I mean, this sounds kind of, I found this in strange kind of context. So I did a book about the financial crisis. Probably remember me talking about this when I was teaching you. I go and sit down with members of the public, and start talking to them about the deficits and about the debt and where everything had come from. And immediately people, not everybody, but significant numbers of people would immediately start pointing to immigration, which is completely unrelated to the financial crisis and why Britain had accumulated so much debt and why it had a large deficit. But people immediately started jumping on this topic. And it is the same with almost anything, education, housing. People will often focus on immigration. So immigration had a huge outsized place in the public imagination. It was connected in the way people thought about it in relation to a whole number of very, very negative aspects about British society. And also, of course, crucially linked to the issue around benefits paid to people who, came to Britain. And obviously it became a particularly big issue in the mid-noughties because of the fact there was the accession of a number of Eastern European states, and Britain was one of the few countries that didn't initially have kind of introductory transition kind of limits on the number of people who could come from those new succession states, and you had a lot of people came over here from Romania and from Poland, and that became a big part of the kind of very negative discourse around migration. So migration and welfare paid to migrants was a huge issue in the lead up to the referendum, and had been for decades. The other issues, farming, I think was a very, very marginal issue for most people. I mean, Britain has historically, not just now, had a tiny proportion of its, this was even true 100 or 200 years ago. I've just been reading a recent history by David Edgerton, and what was really striking about Britain from the 18th and 19th century was how few people were actually involved in agriculture in Britain. There was an agricultural sector, but if you compared it to many other countries in Britain, like for instance Scandinavia, many more people were involved in agriculture. So for a long period of time, we've had agriculture in Britain, though we import a lot of our food, but it's been a small sector employing a relatively small number of people. So I think, relatively speaking, for the public at large, I think it was a relatively marginal issue coming into the referendum. And I think for education as well, free movement, those were issues for Remainers, but I think kind of broadly, those weren't significant issues. I think more broadly as well, public understanding of the EU was very limited amongst the general public. So people's understanding of our relationship to the EU, how it worked, what we got from the EU, how much we paid the benefits of EU membership, I think that knowledge was very, very limited amongst most of the population. And in the months leading up to the referendum, in surveys, significant numbers of people indicated in surveys that they felt that they didn't really understand our relationship to the European Union in a very comprehensive way.
In our last episode, when we were talking to Dr. Nick Stoughton, he kind of mentioned something similar when he said that EU is just a very complex body, which, is hard to explain, especially when you're separated from the European continent.
Absolutely.
And it's like, okay, we have one parliament here in Westminster, and then you have something else in Brussels, and then you have something else in another place. And like, who's the real authority? What's the bargaining power?
Absolutely.
How does the European politics kind of impact the British politics and the British public in general? So again, the complexity of it, but it's interesting how the Leave campaign kind of capitalized on the complexity and kind of came up with these wild numbers that they put up on buses and campaign doors and kind of impacted public opinion through all of it. I mean, it was it's one of the oldest plays in the book, right? Like you find an external enemy to kind of unite an internal population. And in this case, it's like immigrants were painted as an external enemy eating the system away.
But I think, things like the numbers and the stats kind of only really work amongst a population that does have kind of relatively low understanding of Brussels.
Exactly.
And to be honest, it's a really difficult thing to get your head around. It's a complex relationship between Britain and the EU. It hasn't generally been covered by the news media in any depth beyond some of the kind of ridiculous stories that were very common across the tabloids. In general, particularly broadcasters haven't covered, in any depth our relationship to the EU. And there's many reasons for this. I mean, it's seen as a dull story that puts audiences to sleep. One of the former Europe editors, when I interviewed him, said to me, it's difficult to get a story, out there into one of the main bulletins if it was about the EU, because it was seen as very dry, very procedural. It didn't really have that kind of sense of excitement. Whereas he said, if Nigel Farage got up this is obviously years ago, up in the European Parliament, said something outrageous, I'd get a call from somebody else in the pub said, "Have you seen what Nigel Farage? You should be on this." So, it didn't have a lot of color. It didn't have the kind of personality. It didn't have those kind of conflict-driven political stories that made it attractive for particularly broadcasters to cover. So I think, there was limited coverage of the kind of how the EU worked. And that's certainly kind of shown up in the research that was done on that, unless there was a kind of big kind of political ding dong between the two parties in Westminster over Europe, how the EU operated, or there was something that people could immediately grasp, like roaming charges. If it wasn't about that, a lot of the time, what went on in the European Union was barely covered. And obviously, in the tabloid press, it was in much of the tabloid press, it was a relentlessly negative stream of coverage about the EU over many decades.
Right. Your research found that in BBC coverage of the EU in the years before the referendum, voices arguing for the benefits of membership were remarkably sparse.
Yes.
And was that one of the reasons, according to you, that the vote leave kind of won?
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because it's a counterfactual. You've got to go back and say, well, if there had been more of these voices, would it have been different? It's very difficult to know for sure. I suspect it might have been different. I think what it would have meant was that in the campaign period, people would have been able to put forward positive arguments about EU membership that people might have been familiar with. Within the course of, say, a 4 or 6-week campaign, it's very difficult to suddenly create a whole series of arguments about why the EU is great,
right,
and have those resonate with people if they haven't heard them before.
Yeah.
The key thing about messages is you need to repeat them again and again and again and again. You see this all the time. You saw this, when Labour was ejected in 2010 and the Conservatives knew they were going to go on a big period of austerity. In order to justify that, they had to repeat the messages. And Labour, maxed out the credit card. Labour nearly bankrupted Britain. And that message was hit again and again and again and again. And the message discipline from both Labour and the Liberal Dems during that period was ferocious, the message discipline. And that worked. And from the public opinion polling that it worked. So if you want a message to stick, you need to have message discipline. So everybody needs to be on message, and it needs to be repeated again and again. And of course, nobody had really done that in the years and the decades leading up to the actual referendum themselves. And, when I interviewed Craig Oliver, and asked him, as he was obviously heavily involved in the Remain campaign, what would you have done differently? He said, I would have, I wish I'd had a time machine and I could have gone back in time and got people to bang on about the benefits of being in the EU. But the politicians weren't prepared to do that. And what Mark Mardell, the former Europe editor, said to me was, if you went to France and went to Germany, it was a very different discourse. You had politicians, frontline politicians, who'd get up and sing the praises of the EU and say why it was so great, for us to be in the EU. But in Britain, you just didn't get politicians doing that. And he said there were many reasons for this. The key reason, he said, was because of the fact that all politicians of the major parties thought that Europe was a done deal. It was part of the furniture. Okay, and there would never be a referendum. So they didn't need to make the case, because if they were constantly going on making the case, they would inevitably, alienate some people, within their particular party and some people within the wider electorate. And they didn't think the case needed to be made because they never thought that there would be a referendum on this. So those arguments didn't get made, and because of the fact that and certainly not going to appear in much of the Eurosceptic press, and because of the broadcasters, which are people's other kind of main area for kind of news in the lead up to the referendum, in the decades leading up to the referendum, was the broadcasters, and because they rely very much on the politicians as the key agenda setters, and they go there for opinion of the day, but the politicians weren't making those opinions then, weren't presenting those opinions then, people generally didn't hear them, the pro-EU opinions and the pro-EU arguments.
Yeah, I think, if British politicians should have one takeaway from all of this, is that any positive argument in the benefit of the country, like rational positive argument in the benefit of the country, if it has to be made, it takes decades or like years to kind of ensure that that happens. But any counter argument that is negative and it is, rousing in nature can happen within months and kind of tilt the scales.
But I mean, the negative stuff about the EU had been going on for 2 or 3 decades, since at least kind of the Maastricht Treaty. But, even before that, you had a strong Eurosceptic, wing within the Conservative Party. So this is a long time in the making in terms of kind of Eurosceptic arguments. But I think they really kind of took off from the kind of the late 90s onwards. And as one of the news executives at the BBC, said to me, back in the early 2000s, people phoning me up, say, why aren't you featuring more Eurosceptic people on the news? Why aren't you featuring people who want to leave the EU? And the kind of Eurosceptic movement was quite a well funded and a well organized lobby,
Sure.
and it worked hard on the broadcasters to try and push them towards featuring more of that opinion, as well as being very, very, very prominent generally as a kind of movement across the tabloid press, and also part of the broadsheets, obviously the Telegraph as well.
To set the context for the next question that I have, like say from the mid-noughties, like say around the Obama campaign or so in 2008, political campaigns that have really succeeded or have got the media attention have primarily been around taking a specific simplified action, right? So Obama went for change, Trump went for make America great again. Do you think that the Leave campaign, with the tagline of "Take Back Control," which is a very specific oriented, taglines they were more capable and more, I mean, clearly they navigated and they achieved what they were going out for. But when it came to navigating the media and trying to shape the campaign in a particular way that suited their interests, they did a much better job because it was very action oriented. I mean, for me, I think that's what really stood apart in comparison to the Remain campaign, which is more focused on the minutiae and the nuance of the benefits rather than giving them one solid thing.
Well, I mean, the Leave ran a much more focused, better campaign. They focused on a small number of key issues and they banged away at those particular issues. Their marketing was much better. I mean, Take Back Control. I mean, whatever you think about the Leave campaign, was a very, very well crafted and brilliant piece of propaganda, political propaganda. It kind of, in a small single phrase, it kind of captured a whole number of things around sovereignty, around immigration, and different sectors of the population were able to hear that differently. And under that one banner, you were able to unite a disparate group of people. So you had people in perhaps deindustrialized areas in the north of England who felt like they didn't really have any control over their lives, who felt that they were seeing all this social change and immigration that they hadn't agreed to. They were seeing all that, and they felt they wanted to assert some degree of kind of control over their lives. But you also had, people in perhaps the south of England, more traditional conservative voters, who the anti-immigration resonance of that really, really appealed as well. So you were able to, pull together a kind of block of people with a particular kind of phrase that really resonated amongst them in a very, very powerful and simple way. Obviously, they were helped by this, by the centrality of issues such as sovereignty and immigration amongst large sections of the population, which very, very much reflected the kind of public and media discussion in the decades leading up to the referendum. So not only issues around immigration, but the EU in much reporting, particularly in the tabloid press and papers like the Telegraph, strongly focused on things such as the European Convention on Human Rights, interfering, judges in Strasbourg who are preventing us from, extraditing potential terror suspects or, deporting, radical imams or preventing us potentially from, blocking prisoners from getting the vote. So there was a big debate there about judicial interference, which also post-election research suggested was very, very important. Of course, vote take back control resonated amongst that, not just amongst immigration, but also some of those wider arguments that were being made around sovereignty and interference from the EU. So those are very powerful, and those were very, very much amplified by the press during the campaign period, the Eurosceptic press, who very, very much went out much more to bat for the Eurosceptic point of view than the Remain papers did. And the research shows that, the Eurosceptic press pushed the Eurosceptic arguments much, much more heavily than the Remain press pushed, Remain arguments. And the Eurosceptic, the Leave campaign was also much more emotionally resonant for people.
Right, exactly.
It was much more kind of focused at that gut level, and that's very powerful in politics, we know. Whereas the Remain campaign was, it was much more unfocused. It was split amongst all these different parties. It seemed to kind of lack coordination. Many of the people who you'd think has been important within that campaign, like Cameron and Corbyn, seemed, a little. Let's put it this way: be kind, less kind of committed to kind of really pushing that the pro Europe arguments as forcefully as the Leave people were vigorous in pushing their arguments.
Right.
And they lacked a kind of positive argument about the EU, and they felt that they fell back on kind of technocratic arguments, about the damage that the EU leaving the EU would actually affect people's livelihoods. But I feel there's a problem with that. Firstly, a lot of people who voted for EU, not everybody, because it was a complex matrix of people who voted Leave, but many of those people felt the system wasn't working for them anyway. So they wanted to vote for the change, the change option, which was the Leave option. The status quo they felt wasn't delivering, and they were prepared to roll the dice and take a chance. And of course, the Remain arguments, the kind of what was dubbed the Project Fear arguments, also were made by kind of experts and technocrats who had, I think, become to some degree like politicians in the wake of, the great financial crisis, the banking crisis in 2008, and the expenses crisis, had become discredited amongst a significant portion of the population.
Yeah.
So I think their arguments, didn't, for that reason as well, didn't resonate amongst many people.
It's interesting that you mentioned that people kind of voted, like had this whole perception and that feeling that the system wasn't working for them anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, it's an anti-incumbency vote.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
But in 2015, David Cameron gets voted back into power. And in 2016, you have the referendum. So you have 5 years of austerity with the Tories. And yet, when people still feel that the system's not working for you, they kind of vote the country out of EU rather than, raising issues against the incumbent government.
That was because of the fact that up until around 2016, most people didn't like austerity, but the majority of people, and this was very clear in the polling, thought that it was necessary because they came to believe that Britain had been close to bankruptcy, that Labour had radically overspent and crashed the economy. And they felt that there was a need to kind of go back and kind of rein this all in. We've had all of this largesse for so many years. Now's probably the time to kind of tighten the belt. And I mean, the effects of austerity did fall broadly, but many of the harshest effects fell on kind of the vulnerable parts of the population that, many people that were stigmatized and some of the population didn't like. Right. So, that also kind of sweetened the pill of austerity. But the Conservatives got that through because people believed that, there was this big financial crisis and it was absolutely necessary for us to go to this period of austerity. And even though, economists thought this whole thing was ridiculous and there was no, the majority of economists thought that was a very, very flawed policy and austerity was economically illiterate. That wasn't how it was reported by the media, including the BBC, who strongly backed austerity.
Right.
In terms of the range of spokespeople they got on, and even some of their journalists, and um, I interviewed them about this. People like, Robert Peston and Evan Davis, they were very clear at the time that, there was this financial emergency, and that notion, as I say, was strongly contested. The idea that, a temporary deficit of 7 or 8 or 9% was this economic emergency. A lot of economists, strongly contested that was an economic emergency, and austerity was a necessary, necessary response. But and that included some of the world's most senior macroeconomists. But that wasn't the message that the public heard. The message that the public heard was that this was an emergency. Britain was heading towards bankruptcy in parts of the media, and this was absolutely necessary.
When we talk about messaging, there's one side of it, which is mainstream media at BBC and ITV News and so on at Channel 4. But there's also the social media side of things, where social media was kind of firmly integrated into the political spectrum across the world for campaigns and so on and so forth. This referendum was kind of brought back into light the need for social media, capitalizing social media for such major decisions. How did you see the campaign on both sides of the aisle, and how they kind of, was there a particular platform that you felt that the Leave campaign utilized it really effectively? Or
gosh, I'm not sure I can provide that level of granular detail because I'm not a social media expert. What we do know was that generally the mass media, I think, was important in setting the long-term context and the long-term socialization of how people approached their views of the EU, whether they thought it was appropriate to, whether they thought our relationship with the EU was a good thing or not. So I think the media had very, very powerful long-term impacts on how people saw the EU. Social media in the campaign period, I think, was very, very effective at amplifying certain messages and helping with mobilizing and activating both particular discourses and ways of seeing in people's mind, and also mobilizing people to actually get out there and vote on the day. So I think what the role of social media was primarily as a form of amplifying some of the key messages that had been developed over many years, particularly in the print media in Britain.
10 years have passed since Brexit has happened, and the latest polling kind of shows that, or polling has consistently showed that there's growing support for a closer relationship with Europe or the EU, so to speak, right? And young people are overwhelmingly more pro-European. Do you think that the communication landscape has shifted over these last 10 years? Keeping the polling aside, of course. And if there was a referendum that's done today, or maybe a year down the line, do you think the outcome would be different? And has the media environment changed, or has enabled the change in some way?
Well, I mean, I don't think the media environment has enabled the change. I mean, there's been demographic changes that you talked about that are obviously significant. So, part of the cohort that voted Leave has died, and that's obviously because of the fact that age was one of the strongest predictors of people voting Leave, and you were much more likely to vote Leave if you were older. You had less years of formal education. All of those were kind of crucial, predictors of vote Leave. So a cohort of people who voted Leave has died off. And, the younger cohorts obviously tilt now more towards, and probably the population as a whole demographically would tilt towards more, towards Remain. And obviously, because of the fact that there's that old generation has died off, and also the other issue, education, the population each year becomes more educated in terms of the average number of years of education you have, because over the last 25 years we've seen a revolution in the number of people who've gone. When I went to university, first of all in 1985, that sounds a long time ago because it is. Only about 7% of people went to higher education, and now that's up into the 30s, high 30s, maybe low 40s. I haven't seen the latest data, but it's up there. So the cohort that were my time and before me, relatively few people. So every year the proportion of graduates in the economy goes up. Just demographic changes. So both those demographic shifts are leading inexorably towards more people probably supporting joining the EU each year. Has the communication landscape changed in relation to that? Well, it has changed because we talk less about the EU. So since we left the EU, there's been less banging on, particularly in the media, about how terrible the EU is and how awful it is and how much it's damaging the UK. And so to a certain degree, particularly the right of centre media has lost the ability to have a bogeyman as in the form of the EU to blame all Britain's economic and social problems on. Though they're still trying to pin a lot of the problems on kind of a judicial system in the EU, and obviously as pushes to current movement from the European Convention on Human Rights as part of the kind of increasing kind of gradual pulling of the Conservative Party more over towards the right. In terms of the rest of but I do think that these things are only kind of slumbering. And were we to move back towards a kind of situation where we moved into a referendum, I suspect that large parts of the press would begin to bang the drum, very, very much the Eurosceptic drum. So although it's kind of gone quiet talking about Europe and the negative parts of Europe, I would imagine, you will see that kind of reignite from significant parts of the media again, were we to move towards a referendum. But of course, moving towards a referendum depends on the political class and political actors in Westminster deciding that they're going to do that.
Yeah.
And at the moment, they obviously seem very, very anxious not to go down that route. Labour's very nervous about going out down that route. And obviously, were we to have a change in the next election, where the most likely party would probably be a Conservative Reform alliance, obviously then that would be off the table for the foreseeable future. But for obvious reasons, Labour particularly, I think the Labour Party, since the end of Jeremy Corbyn in 2019, the last 7 years, has been very obsessed with a particular segment of the population, and that is what it sees as kind of the voters in its traditional heartland, what's sometimes called the Red Wall.
Yeah.
People who voted Leave, and for that reason, they've been absolutely terrified of kind of raising that kind of issue at all. There is obviously a slight irony here in doing that, and in the other stances that they've taken to try and appeal to that particular segment of the population. They've ended up alienating lots of their other parts of their kind of broad coalition, and Labour has always been a kind of broad coalition of voters, which you might think of as being the kind of younger, more liberal, more kind of urban to some degree voters, though they're not all urban, as we saw in the Denton by-election, who are moving over to the Greens. And actually, the kind of irony is this: in trying to kind of move towards reform and kind of appeal to what they see as a kind of mythical red wall voter, they're losing votes to the Greens, which are hitting them badly in those kind of red wall seats, because it's not. I mean, there are kind of Labour to reform defectors, but what's also happening, probably to a larger degree, as the pollster John Curtis has pointed out, is that the Greens are eating into their share in those things, which is leading them to have a falling vote share, which is then letting in reform. So for all of these many reasons, I think the prospects of a referendum in the near term are not large. But were there to be one, I suspect there's a reasonable chance that Remain might win. but that would create, I think, a significant fracture within the country, and it would be absolute red meat for parts of the media in this country.
Well, folks, that was my conversation with Dr. Mike Berry talking about the Brexit referendum. Our thanks to Mike for chatting to us. It was a real trip down memory lane for Tom and I.
We hope you enjoyed the episode. Let us know in the comments, give us a rating. Sharing with your friends, family, fellow classmates, and colleagues really helps us out.
This has been a Be the Change Media Network production. I'm Tom Spare.
I'm Lily Mott.
And I'm Sid Kurapati. You've been listening to the Political Dispatch.
Well, at 20 minutes to 5, we can now say the decision taken in 1975 by this country to join the common market has been reversed by this referendum to leave the EU.
The British people have made a choice. That not only needs to be respected, but those on the losing side of the argument, myself included, should help to make it work.
Let June the 23rd go down in our history as our Independence Day.
Conference, mark my words, we will make Brexit a success.
The British people have spoken, and the answer is we're out.